and this is going to be a little different.
A little lighter.
Yeah, a little bit lighter, a little more relaxed. We're going to talk about the doom and gloom of the internet, so that'll be fun.
Yeah, I mean lighter, like easier to understand. I only understand about 2% of that. Really interesting, really excellent presentation, but you have to remember, I'm a good example of a lay audience. So,
absolutely. So this is Helena Bottemiller Evich. Hope I didn't butcher that. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of foodfix.co, which is a really cool newsletter all about food. You guys should check that out. She is also an award-winning journalist. I mean, you have gotten a George Polk Award, which is amazing. And then let's see here, 2 James Beard Awards and a finalist. That's really cool. So she knows a lot about food. She can write about food and she can make all of the science interesting. So we're going to talk a bit about science communication and how your world as a journalist, writing about food, writing about nutrition, is impacted by the reality of alternative facts and fake news and a lot of the crazy town we're seeing.
Yeah, well, I'm really delighted to be here. I think science communication is probably one of the more important and less focused on topics in society. Like you just don't hear a lot of debate about or a lot of conversation about the importance of science communication, or maybe you do in science world, but I think as the general public doesn't think about it much, but I think it is so, so important. And particularly throughout the pandemic, we've really seen what happens when we don't have good science communication or when you don't have good trust in the public. And so I think as a journalist, we're struggling in media with a lot of the same issues that, the scientific community is experiencing, the government, this eroding trust in institutions. And it's something that really cuts across so many different sectors. And I think that is really the foundation for a lot of the challenges we're seeing right now with misinformation. It's like we're swimming in a soup of content and you have to, discern what is trustworthy and what's not. And I think when institutions are weakened and distrust, you kind of have a recipe for these, frankly, misinformation and really fake news and all of that to sort of take hold and make it more difficult to sort of sort through everything. So it's like a tough time for, I think, all of us that are trying to do communication. Yeah,
absolutely. So how do you assess the factual basis of information you use in your stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard because I think on one hand, trust is eroding in institutions, but I still think they're very important. I think a lot of folks in the media still rely on institutions. So if FDA has made a determination on an additive or, the one example is, bioengineered ingredients, anytime that comes up, you'll see the FDA statement, the FDA is determined, there's no significant difference. There's no safety concern. And so I think in some ways institutions are still so important for determining what is credible and what is not. If it's a research study being cited, I think the credibility or the name of the institution still matters, right? Does someone, we tend to trust studies that are published in major journals or that come out of major universities. So I think institutions are still very important in determining credibility or sort of lending credibility to facts or to findings. But that's what makes it so hard right now because, you can have a determination from a federal agency, but if you have a significant amount of the public that doesn't trust that, what are you left with? I just looked up last year, what was the trust factor we have for FDA. And I think it's 37% of the public has I think it's very high trust or strong trust in FDA. I mean, that's really low. So that's a tough spot to be in, just as one example.
Absolutely. So, one thing we find in academia land is some of the even the studies from big universities, there'll be a press release that kind of may not match with the actual findings or some of the methodology. There we might find something, and our center has not me. That's not my specialty, but our center.
We can't blame you for the press releases.
For the press releases, but our faculty have actually responded to some studies where they're like, "Hey, the method in that was not quite right." So how do you kind of handle that if you've say written something or seen this big, splashy, exciting headline and it's a little overstated?
Well, this is really hard. And I do think universities in particular bear responsibility here. I mean, I can think of a couple examples where press releases went out and there were a couple news stories and then everything had to get walked back because, the press release absolutely overstated the finding, and it was sort of a situation. So I do think there's a lot of responsibility there. In terms of single studies, I try to not cover single studies, but it becomes challenging. I cover food policy. So if a study comes out and it has relevance to like the dietary guidelines or a certain policy debate, like, maybe heavy metals in baby food or whatever the issue is, you kind of do need to at least flag it for your readers that this has happened. And I think, always talking about, what the institution was, where it was published, was it peer reviewed, was this pre-publication, what the funding sources were. I think these are all important things you can include to help the reader sort of assess it, but it's really hard. I mean, some of the scientific debates I've covered, there are actually different universes of evidence that different universes of science believe, or universes of scientists believe. And so when that happens, it's really hard for one study to not come out and then, the other sort of universe going, that's horrible. They have the wrong methodology. And anytime you have journalists litigating fights over scientific methodology, you're in a bad spot. You don't want reporters to be like, well, this group of researchers said they didn't use the right. I mean, that is a really tough spot to be in. And I think readers are not well served by that. But I mean, that happens in science a lot, right? These are not all settled issues. And so it's a difficult thing, but I think trying to not cover like the one-off studies is like the first place to start.
Yeah. So looking more at a
trend, like we're seeing more research come out and here's some of the things that are being found. There's increasing evidence on this would be more helpful than like, here's one study and, we have nothing else to go on.
So how can academics and academic centers, how can the scientists involved in this help you as like a reporter or a journalist in general? I mean, how can we do that?
I think getting on the phone is really good. Figuring out how you explain whatever your research is to like a sixth grader or your great aunt at Thanksgiving. These are really important exercises. Like you should be able to explain what you're doing, why it matters in a very simple way to a layperson who knows like nothing about your topic. And that's really hard. And I know I deal with scientists. I also deal with lawyers who get really uncomfortable with this. They're like, they don't want to use the wrong, verbiage or whatever. So you can always talk to a reporter on background or even off the record. If you don't want, like, if you're worried about, maybe using the wrong word or you're nervous about how you're going to be quoted, you can still inform a story by saying, hey, I want to just explain this to you off the record. I just want to sort of inform your understanding of this topic. I think that's really, really helpful to do. Just trying to rely on a press release or a reporter reading a study is probably not the best idea. You want to give them as much context as possible. I think that's good. And also, if you see things reported on that are wrong, I encourage you every single time to reach out to that, especially if it's in your field of expertise. Reach out to that reporter or editor. Oftentimes they're listed either on the top or the bottom of the story, and explain to them what they got wrong. I mean, most reporters are trying to get it right. They're not trying to put misinformation or put a story out there that lacks context. So I encourage you to give that feedback because it's important. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, as center director, I do a lot of interviews for press and news, radio, and especially for the press media. I notice I can categorize the people that interview me into two large groups. One of which I would say are really, as you point out, very they find trying to get the story right very important. And one of the things that they often will do is ask me to review what they've taken away from my interview. It's not that I'm going to proofread their entire article. It's often they're interviewing a lot of different people for a piece. And I find that many of the reporters don't do that. I'm wondering what's your attitude on that? 'Cause I know a lot of times reporters are worried that you're going to influence how the story is pitched, but it's also important to get the facts right.
Mhm.
And often that doesn't happen in a 20-minute interview over the phone.
So will they actually show you like your quotes or how they're paraphrasing it?
Yeah, they will show the section that they interviewed me on.
Mhm, mhm.
And did they actually get what I said correctly? They want to double check that.
Okay. Well, every outlet has a different policy on this. Most editors I've had do not allow you to show like the story before it goes live. But what I tend to do is actually read aloud sections to say like, hey, is this, did I get any of this wording right? And you will find stuff. A scientist will be like, that word might be a little strong, and it's helpful, right? So I think that's like a good practice to do. But what you don't want to be doing is running by chunks of your story by one expert or another who may have like a differing view and having them edit other folks' interpretation. So it can be tricky, but I think that extra layer of fact checking and running back to the researcher or subject matter expert and saying like, hey, have I accurately conveyed this, especially when you're paraphrasing? Because a lot of times what we do is we're talking to subject matter experts and then we have to re-explain, like going back to how would you explain this to your aunt at Thanksgiving? And so it does require some interpretation. So I think fact checking is great, but you do want to be a little careful about like sending your story over to have people make changes that they want to see. Yeah.
So how do people trust information these days in your experiences? If it's not necessarily through your work, who do you see influencing this conversation?
Well, I think it's kind of all over the map. I think institutions are kind of on the decline in terms of trust, and I'm not sure what all can be done about that. I mean, it certainly is something that's, I think, worthy of a lot of debate, because when you have a public health crisis, you start to see like the benefits of trusting institutions, like, oh, it's a lot harder to respond when you don't have some of that basic trust. I think social media is playing an interesting role here. I mean, in some ways, there's more garbage on the internet than ever before, right? There's more misinformation. There's so much nonsense. There's so much just absolutely not fact-based stuff on the internet, but also we're kind of in a golden age of science communication. Like you can follow amazing experts and researchers on Instagram, on TikTok, and they're doing incredible science communication in terms of like explaining. I love following anyone who will sort of explain, this paper just came out. You may have seen a headline, but like, here's, as someone who studies vaccines, here's my take on it. Here's how I read this paper. Here's why it's important. Here's how it compares to the evidence we already have. And that is amazing that's all at the, just in your smartphone, you can have that access of information. I think what's really hard is we don't have a lot of like information literacy. We're not really taught like, how do you sort of sift through like who is a very trustworthy person on Instagram who's talking about vaccines and really delivering like incredibly valuable information about what the scientific literature says, and who is sort of spouting maybe questionable views that are not based in peer-reviewed science, and teaching consumers how to like navigate that. I think it's really difficult, and I don't think we really do that. So it's tough. Like, I think, the trust in news is way down. I actually pulled it up from Gallup. The trust in newspapers right now, 46% of the public says they have very little trust in newspapers, 46%. And in 1973, it was 18%. So it's like a pretty big plummet. And that kind of tracks along institutions. So we're tending to trust like individuals and people now more. Like we kind of form parasocial relationships with people we follow, whether they're writers or scientists. And we're kind of in an era where I think people are glomming onto following individuals almost more so than institutions. And there's like there's some downsides with that too.
There are some downsides.
Yeah.
And we've noticed that in a lot of our social listening activities too. We can see trends. It's pretty cool. You can watch and see where the trends go, where people are getting their information, how they're getting their information.
Yeah. But like influencers are sort of a growing.
Yeah, influencers. So for every, and this is not based on statistics. This is more from what I've been kind of following. It seems for every one great communicator, there are like 5 people selling supplements, and they're not good supplements. And you're just like, oh golly, that's a thing. So we're trying to combat that. I mean, at CRIS, we put out a lot of fact-based information in blogs. So if people are going to search, at least they can get some good information backed by
Google
studies.
search is one of the more trusted forms of information. Like search, it ranks above media, government, earned media, like all of that. It's Google search. So I don't know if that should make us feel better or worse. But,
well, the algorithm certainly helps us because it helps people find our information, which we take a lot of time and care to make sure is sourced through, peer-reviewed papers that are good.
And does your website actually say msu.edu? Like, is it?
Yes.
Okay. So when people,
Yeah, that's part of the branding of what we've done intentionally at CRIS, is to make sure that there is an institution behind us. There are researchers behind us. People can see, our mission, our vision. Who are these people? You can click on my name, other people's names, who, the PhD scientists.
I think that's helpful. Yeah.
It helps, in my opinion, to make sure there is some trust and legitimacy. But we've also noticed a trend where people are now searching through Instagram and TikTok to find information, which is terrifying. And have you noticed any of that is impacting how you?
Yeah. I mean, I think we are totally underestimating how much news consumption is happening or information consumption is happening on social media. And I'll give you an example. During earlier this year, I was covering the infant formula crisis and shortage. I was talking to parents a lot through particularly February through June of this year. And I think almost everyone I talked to was getting their information on Instagram. And some of them were getting good information, right? Like they were maybe even following news influencers or news accounts. And that's where they were seeing information about recalls. But a lot of them were getting their information actually from mom influencers who were talking about the infant formula shortage. They were giving daily updates. So they were giving actually pretty solid information. Like, here's the latest from FDA. They were staying on it. But it was coming from Instagram. And it was sort of a gut check moment for me of like, no one is getting updated recall information that I'm talking to from like news articles, like the old fashioned sort of Google News or sort of the nightly news. They were all getting their information from Instagram.
The other side of that is we saw a lot of that same around, heavy metals, but particularly the shortage in formula, and the recipes that were being shared for infant formula were terrifying. Yeah. So we actually did a piece on this, and we're like, hey, don't do this. And they'd share, this is what people did in, 50, 60 years ago, which is like, may have been fine then, but we know a lot more about human nutrition, specifically for infants. So that's something we tried to combat by putting out factual information. So if somebody did do the Google search, maybe we'd come up a little bit higher than the influencer saying,
this is fine.
Yeah, this is totally fine.
Yeah,
actually, is all that there is. You're like, it's a little different than that.
It's been on my to-do list. The Census Bureau has this great pulse survey that basically tracks in real time how households have responded during the pandemic. So like financially, all sorts of things, public health messaging. And they just added a whole section on infant formula and the response. And I need to pull the numbers, but I believe I saw like a pretty alarming chunk of people reporting that they were doing homemade formula or watering down, which I'm not even sure which is worse, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
probably. I mean, so even though the Academy of Pediatrics and so many other entities were like, please, please, please do not do this. I think public health messaging is just really hard.
I think it is. And then we also saw an influx of people now saying, well, because this happened, this proves that all of the formula, say, out of Europe is better than the formula that you would find based in the US. And that's something that I think
that was already happening.
Yeah, it was already happening.
They were illegally importing it, actually.
Yeah, they still are. Yeah, they still are illegally importing it. And I explained that to a few people on the internet, which didn't do anybody any good. It just made me mad. But yeah, you'll have people illegally importing this, and it's not being, you don't know how it's shipped, right? So it can be shipped in any sort of way, and you end up with contamination because it might be not refrigerated or kept at the right temperature, or bacteria from it. Yeah. So how do you see social media influencing actions versus how, say, journalism may have influenced actions in the past? Or have you not noticed any change, really?
I mean, I think so much of the power and influence has shifted to social media. Going back to the infant formula situation, there's an Instagram account called The Formula Mom, and she's really follows all the formula. Every step of the formula shortage, she's been all over it. And, shares a lot of really good information. But she has 300,000 followers or something. So one of her posts on Instagram is going to get more traffic, more eyeballs than your average news article. And many news segments, actually, even national news segments might not get hundreds of thousands of eyeballs. So remembering that context of just how attention has shifted and how people are getting their information. Everyone is on TikTok now, right? Yeah. We were just talking about this. People are tweeting at me, please do a TikTok on FDA's healthy labeling. And I'm like, I feel like a geriatric millennial. I don't know how to do TikTok. My younger sister's always sending me them. But that's where everyone is going and spending a lot of time, and there is a lot of information being shared. So I don't know. On one hand, it's more people who are trying to do more fact-based or trying to share fact-based information should be on TikTok, but it's also a cesspool of misinformation.
It's also a lot of work. And
it's
I think
so much
part
work.
of what you see news organizations charging, right? So your newspaper needs to charge in order to fund this. Social media is free because they pay through advertising. They get your data is their product, right?
It's a great business to be in. They're making a ton of money.
No, they really are. Tons of it, all of it, all the money. So then you see video taking over versus people reading content.
Yeah.
And, video is a whole nother, I won't say can of worms, but yeah.
It is. It's also harder to moderate. It's harder for AI to read what's in a video and take it down. The whole moderation of video is a whole other ball of wax. Yeah. The misinformation. But on TikTok, there's also incredible communicators too. But again, you have to find them. There's this gal named, I think it's Kayla Scanlon, and she just explains the Federal Reserve, and they're incredibly informative. And in 45 seconds, you can be wow, I totally understand what the Fed's doing. And I think right. It's that's hard to do. Yeah. And she said her videos take 6 hours to make, and they're 45 seconds. And so we forget how much goes into we call it content creation. There's a reason we call it the creator economy, because these people are creating so much content that's then being monetized through, TikTok and Instagram are making a ton of money off this content. And all of the algorithms are geared towards engagement and keeping us on it, because then they make more money. So keep scrolling. Right. And then you get the incentive, even more incentives around conflict. So you already have a natural incentive toward conflict in news, right? Everyone wants to click on something dramatic, not everything worked today, right? That's not what we click on. We click on the crazy fight between two politicians that are just going at it. And that's naturally what we're drawn to. But social media is even worse, because the entire basis for it is attention. How much attention can you keep in the app? And I think that does incentivize a lot of negativity and toxic debate. So there's some real downsides there too. Yeah.
And that's exactly what, academics, as an academic, they don't want that controversy in their lives, So it's almost as if even all of us from academic or industry in this room, and we want to put out messaging and make it clearer, and even if we can bring it to distill it down to sixth graders, still, if that's what gets the clicks, is things that are more controversial, I just don't want that in my inboxes. I don't want that in my life. There's enough controversy just among the graduate students or the politics inside of academia to then bring lay people into that conversation. As much as I want to do this, I want to be able to learn how to take 6 hours and distill it in 45 seconds. I don't want that controversy. So I don't know how can someone like you ever convince me to be a better communicator and actually give press releases on the things that I do know about, and it's good news.
I mean, I think that's a really, really good point and a really big challenge. And I think if you were to talk to science communicators, their mental health is probably worse for how much hate they get online.
It's a lot. It is a lot. It's a tremendous amount of hate. Yeah. And if you
Yeah.
You know,
I'm
we
not
can
saying it's
account
all
to-
rosy,
yeah.
but that's where people are. That's the
Yeah.
hard thing. That's where
But,
they
you know,
are.
And maybe
I know.
that's
Yeah.
where what people like what our center at Chris does. I mean, like we would like to filter it. That is the goal. If again, there's only a
Yeah. You
handful
could
of
probably
people doing
feature
this.
scientists instead of having them
Having-
use their personal accounts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something that we look at, you know, how we do business, like how we communicate out, you know, taking it and featuring a scientist or having someone like me be the, not
Like interview.
share the information and, you know, cite the information to, you know, try and help support scientists. And maybe there's a space for that type of interaction.
It's also such a time suck. That's one of the reasons I'm not on TikTok is like, okay, well, I could spend 6 hours making a video about FDA healthy labeling, but like you have no idea how well that's going to do. And also like, what is the end goal? Are you just trying to get eyeballs? So then you have to make another TikTok the next day and then the next day. And so it's this, there's also like a hamster wheel of content creation that you can get on and then they can just change the algorithm. So I'm not, I don't want to say this is like a rosy like thing to get into, but it's just the fact of the matter is this is where attention is. And this is where a lot of information is being shared. And like, that's just the reality of it. Yeah.
Question, moving to that topic. So certainly in the information age, we can Google anything or we can pull up, you know, podcasts or whatnot. But what would your recommendation be to the average person? We keep hearing that they have probably a 6th grade education or level of science education. What would you recommend to the average person about how they can filter through what's real and not? Because there's so much of both. What should the average person be looking for to get a sense of whether the information that they're reading in social media or even in the print media is actually something they can count on as being accurate? Recommendation.
I think this is so hard. Yeah. I mean, you can obviously look for the things we talked about, like credible institutions. Does the person have credentials? Are they like, if you're again, going back to the vaccine thing, are you listening to someone who actually studies this or are they in a completely different field? Because you can find doctors that are very anti-vaccine, you know, MDs as well, right? So it can't just be like, oh, everyone who has base level, you know, if they're a nurse, that doesn't mean that everything they say is credible, right? So I think it's really difficult. Certainly the mainstream news publications, even though I think there's a general decline in credibility, all of those institutions have checks for making sure information is correct. They have editing, you know, they'll issue corrections when things are wrong. So there is like some content moderation that's really important, which is absolutely not the case for everything on social media, right? They're not going to issue corrections when they get things wrong. But it's really hard. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned several times credible institutions
Yeah.
and COVID vaccine in the same context. When you look back at the recommendations of dictates that came from Food and Drug Administration, Centers for Disease Control, and you look back now, many of those were absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
And not only wrong, but based on, at the time, these were based on the institution having, maybe to be nice, grossly exaggerated. Like, the vaccine is going to protect you from getting
Yeah.
If you're vaccinated, you're not going to spread the virus. It's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So I'm trying to get to this. How can you talk about these in light of the COVID vaccine without bringing up how justifiably uncredible they are viewed now?
Well, I think the whole point is that their credibility has been eroded, right?
Yeah.
So right now, people are not trusting those institutions as much, I think in large part because of the changing messaging. Yeah.
On themselves, because
Well.
it has been shown that a lot of their pronouncements were either wrong or grossly overstated.
Well,
Yeah, I think what they would say is like the science changed a lot, right? We rushed through the vaccine process as much as possible. We didn't know. I think at the time we did think that the vaccines would significantly cut down on spread to an extent that they have not, right? So I think this it's both that the science changed, but also at the time, I don't know that the uncertainty around what we knew and didn't know was really communicated, right? Like were we putting public health messaging in the right context of like, we still do not know a lot of, yeah.
Under the guise of science,
Mhm.
the CDC was issuing recommendations that they were getting from the teachers union
About,
in terms of COVID in schools.
yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific instance. I cover food policy, but I think the changing messaging has certainly damaged the credibility and sort of it's hard for people to still tune in when the message has changed. But a lot of folks in the scientific community would say like our understanding was evolving in real time. And so how you do public health messaging in a situation like that, I don't know the answer to that. I think that's really, really difficult. So, but it's a good question. Yeah.
So related and unrelated at the same time, I think, and I have nothing to back this up, but I think that part of the reason we have an issue with credibility is for so long, us as researchers have really abdicated the responsibility of communicating our findings, our expertise to the public. And that void was then subsequently filled by people without proper training, or maybe they have ulterior motive. And so I guess my question would be, in light of eroding credibility of institutions, of the press, of professional scientists, and an increase in consumption of social media news and connection to somebody that they've never met before, but they seem relatable and they're a nice person. How would you suggest, as researchers who frequently don't have 6 hours in a day to make a 45-second video, you take the floor back and at least be able to get our message out in a consumable and reliable way to where we can at least maybe try to build back the losses?
I mean,
That's a big question. $1 million one. Even.
Yeah. I think
Has there been anything that's worked? Like, I mean,
well, I think to be clear, I think the researchers that are on Instagram and TikTok that are like taking the time to do that are excellent. Like they are doing incredible science communication. And some of them have hundreds of thousands of followers. I mean, they have big million, big
followers.
audiences. So I think there is a role for that. But like, I think it's a really good question of like, how much time should your average university researcher be spending on social media? Like that's, I don't know the answer to that. Like that's a really good question. And I think any type of engagement is, in media or the public is good, right? The more you can explain your research, the better, but it's really hard. Like I find it hard to navigate things. I find it hard to get information, and I'm a reporter in a newsroom, right? Like my job is to navigate policy, and I will try to research things and be like, I cannot figure out what's credible. I mean, it's hard. It's really, really hard.
So we have 2 more minutes. There another question?
Just a question regarding that point about the excellent communicators that are there with a large following. How much overlap of those people that are following them with the folks that are listening or following the disinformation? Is there any overlap? Just terrific.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if I've seen any like research done on that. But certainly a huge challenge we have is people are self-selecting into their echo chambers, right?
Information bubbles are real.
Yeah,
And I mean, it
huge.
starts with Google, right? Even the Google search engine has their own information bubble. So what you would get from doing, say, an incognito search is going to be different than the one that's customized for you.
Yeah. I think we're also self-selecting into like, partisan media outlets, which is really big. So if you don't believe CNN, if you don't believe anything on CNN, like you're going to self-select to other news outlets. And then, yeah, I don't think there is a big Venn diagram between, there isn't a little middle that's reading both. And that's its own challenge. Yeah.
If you had some advice for the toxicology community to deal with some of these issues, like for example, I'll just give you one example that disturbed me a little bit yesterday. We were having a discussion about risk management in Europe. And one of the members of the committee said it's becoming so conservative in Europe. His fear is that consumers are going to lose out on chemistry. It's going to be so chemophobic that the risk will become not having the chemistry as opposed to having things that are safe. And so, I think that toxicology doesn't do a very good job in the field of risk communication. People understand, for example, that some risks are worth taking. But if we step away just from that point into the broader area, how can toxicologists be more effective in helping consumers understand when things are safe? And how can we help consumers with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. I think for some of this stuff, it's like really personal. So bringing your research as a personal lens of like, here's how I think about risks. Here's how I think about when I think about, the linings of food packages or whatever. Here is, as someone who studies this is what I think. This is how I think about it with my family. I think those kinds of things are powerful. Just to give you one example, my sister just had a baby 2 weeks ago. And she sent me this morning the headline from the study out of Italy. The microplastics were found in breast milk, I guess. And when you're a new mom and you get a piece of information like that, I don't know that there is enough science communication in the world to like convince you that that's not a concern you should have at that moment.
The headline where babies are born pre-polluted. I think that was the one.
Oh, I didn't see that. Yeah, she sent me the actual. She sent me an actual press report.
Terrifying, and I'm like, oh yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, and a lot of fear and like moral panic and whatever happens that some people think in retrospect looks irrational is usually based on what would you believe without needing any evidence, right? And I think if you don't have any evidence and you just see, oh, there's this one study that microplastics are in breast milk, that just sounds alarming. And you don't really need to read, oh, are there all these other peer-reviewed journals? Like, I mean, so I think that's just an emotional, I think talking about things in personal ways is probably good, but it's tough. I mean, there's also another science communicator, kind of risk communicator, Emily Oster, and she does a lot of parent stuff. And on Instagram does a lot of this stuff where parents write in, how should I be thinking about this? How should I be thinking about this? And a lot of times the answer is, you don't need to worry about that. Like a lot of it is that. But it comes from a place of it's her personal, she's looking at the data as a parent, right? So her books are about, I do care about risk. I'm looking at what do we know about all of these different issues. And she looks at the evidence and she talks about how she comes to a conclusion of like, this is what I've looked at. This is how I would think about these risks. And I think there is power in that because it's not just like nameless researcher sort of making calculations. It's like, I'm a parent and I'm thinking about this. And this is the conclusion I've drawn for myself. And I think there's some connectivity there that is probably more salient than just like reading someone's statistics. Yeah.
For example, communicate with, I'll call her an influencer. It sounds like she has influencers like her then to, work with them to identify issues and maybe build.
Yeah, there's a lot of that happening, not just for marketing, like a lot of food marketers and stuff are doing that, but also I know advocates are working on that now. Like I just heard an example recently of anti-hunger advocates working with influencers, trying to get them to share messages around making sure parents know they have to sign up for school meals this year because universal free meals have ended. So there's a lot of messaging work happening with influencers in all different ways. So I think that's something that kind of everyone's exploring right now. How do you do that? And I don't know how you're also transparent about that, right? Like it's a wild world we're living in. I did not come here to give you all the answers, but it's fraught even for me. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We are at our limit and this was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you.